Okay, we are in the book of Deuteronomy and in our study of the Pentateuch. Classes are winding down. It is November the 19th, 2014. And after this class, we've only got 2 classes left. So we finished the book of Numbers last week. And this week we are going to start the book of Deuteronomy, which is the 5th book of the Pentateuch. Can anybody here name the 5 books of the Torah? Kenny.
You got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy.
Okay, Destiny, do you think you can do that?
Yeah, I know I can.
Let me hear you.
Okay, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers.
Do it in order, though. Do it in order.
It's like 8 of them. Just kidding.
Okay.
Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, right? Or is it Leviticus and then Numbers?
Leviticus.
Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy.
Deuteronomy. Jeff.
Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy.
Very good.
Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy.
Now, did you notice I didn't even have to call Max's name out? Body language, I looked at him and he knew. Okay. Okay, Isaac.
Me?
The 5 book, yes, you. The 5 books of the Torah.
Before I answer your question, but I do have a question. Answer.
Okay.
Can we honestly say that there's only 5 books for the Pentateuch?
I thought that was 4.
Yes,
Only 5.
Is it
5.
5?
Penta means 5.
5. Knew it.
Yeah.
Can we honestly say that Leviticus and Numbers belong where they belong in the order? Leviticus and
Have you been reading liberal
No.
scholarship? Okay. Okay.
It's
By the way, I'm going to talk about that a little bit today. Okay.
it's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
Joshua, Nehemiah.
Okay. You don't need to sing it. Okay.
The song.
Oscar. Oh yeah. I mean, in CC they sing it. Yeah. Go ahead. Okay. I got to have quiet while Oscar gives me the 5 books of the Pentateuch.
Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy.
Okay, Lauren, give me the 5 books of the Torah.
Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy.
Now, so when I say Pentateuch and Torah, does everybody realize that they're synonymous terms? Okay. One's Greek, that's Torah. Torah. Destiny, can you say Torah but roll your R?
Maybe. I don't know.
Try it. Give it a try.
My R doesn't roll.
Try it.
I have to think about it.
Sounds like our direction.
Torah. I can't do it.
Say Torah.
I
Okay.
can only roll my R's after sentences.
Oh, it's got to be at the end. Can you do it, Lauren?
I don't think so.
Okay. You're not a real good at.
Can you roll your R's, Lauren?
It's a good thing. It's a good thing you weren't born and grew up speaking Spanish. Because if you can't roll your R's, you'd never be really good at it. Yes.
But if I did,
Oh no, I was always.
Wait,
Okay.
Oscar probably can.
No, I can't.
No.
I've never been able
Can you?
Torah.
Very good. I've never heard a Hebrew. I've never heard that in Hebrew. They roll their R's in a lot of words, but not for Torah. Torah. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started in Deuteronomy. I need your attention, please. We are being recorded. Okay. You guys ready?
Yeah.
Okay. This is an introduction to Deuteronomy. First of all, we're going to look at the title of the book. Okay. You notice, so like when we cover these books, we're not actually expositing. We're not doing an expository talk through the books. We're actually telling you about the books and then highlights of the book. You notice in the Pentateuch, that's what we've been doing. We've talked about the documentary hypothesis, the JEDP and things like that. So here we're going to look at the title of the book, and we're going to look at the English derivation of the book first. Oh man, this is bad. I'm losing my voice. Class hasn't even started yet. Okay, English derivation. Deuteronomy comes from the Greek Septuagint. Everybody knows what that is, the Greek Septuagint. Anybody not know what the Greek Septuagint is? Everybody knows? If I called on somebody, would you be able to answer? Jeff, what is it?
It was the Hebrew Bible translated into Greek.
Very good. Good. Okay. So the Deuteronomy comes from the Greek Septuagint. It is a mistranslation of copy of this law taken from Deuteronomy 17:18. I'm going to go ahead and read that. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 18. And it's actually a verse taken out of a chapter that talks about when God establishes human kings in Israel. So Deuteronomy 17:18. The title for the book in English is a mistranslation of what comes out of this. Here's verse 18. Also it shall be, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write for himself, and here we go, a copy of this law in a book from the one before the priests, the Levites. Okay, so he shall write a copy of this law. So here's that phrase. We get the name for Deuteronomy from this. Out of Deuteronomy 17:18. Okay. So anyway, if you see the Hebrew for that, you got this. It says Mishnah HaTorah. Anybody ever heard of the Mishnah? It means like copy, but Mishnah HaTorah. That's what the Greek is going to come from that Hebrew phrase right there. Okay. And they come up with the phrase deuteronomion. Okay, nomion. Deuteronomion. So the Greek was rendered in the Latin Vulgate. Okay, so anyway, then we have a Latin Bible. If you happen to be Catholic or you have relatives that are Catholic or something like that, we actually get our name, the Deuteronomion, in the Latin is Deuteronomium. Okay, numium. Okay, that's the Latin. Almost the same thing.
Thank you.
But anyway, that's where we get the title Deuteronomy. Okay. Let me put up here's the Greek here. I gotta copy that because my spelling in Greek is terrible. You guys didn't know that when I was teaching you guys Greek, that my spelling is terrible.
With such confidence, Jim.
What's that? Oh,
With such confidence.
why? Thank you.
Your spelling was terrible, though.
What's that?
I thought your spelling was terrible.
Oh well, some things I just have a hard time with, I guess.
Just
Easy.
Okay, that's that in Greek. Okay, that's the name Deuteronomy in Greek. Okay. You all know if I wrote Deuteronomy in English, okay, same thing, except that's where we get the name in Greek. And so the Greek and the Latin is what actually is on our English Bibles. We kind of have like an English transliteration of the Latin from the Greek. And the Greek, of course, was taken from that one phrase, Deuteronomy 17:18. But it's not the Hebrew title. So the Hebrew title is going to be different. So when we look at the Hebrew title, Um, the Hebrew title is the translation of the first two words in other words, if you look at the book of Deuteronomy in Hebrew, the very first two words is the translation. So basically, don't have any room. Okay. You all done with this? Everybody done with this? No? I'm going to start erasing. Okay. No. Just to make sure I don't since it's on tape, I don't want to misspell it. Because then somebody could check it. And typically all you're going to see is just this part right here if you look at a Hebrew Bible. But it says El Devarim, okay? And this is it right here, okay? Devarim. And basically, okay. When you see something like that up there, that's like a half vowel. That means like you punch it, you get off it really quick. So like you hear that Hebrew phrase like, Rajit, and some people would say like Berajit. It's like a BR instead of you don't say bra, you say bara. Okay, but bra would be like the half vowel. It's like it's devarim. Okay, it's like you got to just do it really quick. Okay, but since this isn't Hebrew class, it doesn't make any difference to you guys. Okay, so that's the Hebrew there. That's the actual title of the book, and it's actually a more accurate title of the book, okay? And we'll get into that in just a minute. Anyway, in English, it means this. These are the words. By the way, the word davar in Hebrew is word, okay? Devarim means words, okay? So these, the words, okay? Those are the words. So the Hebrew title is the translation of the first two words of the book. In English, these are the words. Note that the Hebrew title does not describe a second law. Deuteronomy means second law, and technically this is not a second law, okay, even though that's what we call it. But it is rather the record of Moses' words of explanation concerning the law. In other words, Moses was going through and he was explaining the laws that are given in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And then since he was giving a commentary and added information in those laws, in other words, he was explaining to the second generation what the law was all about. And then what he said was recorded, and then that in itself is the book of Deuteronomy. Make sense, everybody? Mm-hmm. So technically, the word Deuteronomy is a misnomer. It's not what the book really means, and it's not an accurate representation of the book, because it is not a second law. It is an explanation of the law given to the second generation of Israelites. Remember, in the book of Numbers, there is 2 generations that are highlighted. So Deuteronomy is the 5th and last of the books of Moses, also called the Law or the Writings of Moses. Okay. So let's take a look at the author of Deuteronomy. The book itself states that Moses is the author. For instance, if I turn to the very first verse, and if you have your Bibles, turn to the very first verse. Everybody open their Bibles up, first verse. So if I was going to ask Destiny to read verse 1, what do you read?
Of Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
These are the words which Moses spoke to all Israel on this side of the Jordan in the wilderness, in the plain opposite, whatever the word is, between Paran, Tophel, Laban, Hazarah, and
Okay. So the very first part, these are the words which Moses spoke to all Israel. So in other words, right from the very beginning, the book itself is describing Moses as taking an active part, but basically as the author. Okay. In Deuteronomy 1:5 it says Moses began to explain this law, saying, again it's Moses. In other words, Moses is explaining the law. What law? Well, the law that was given in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. He's explaining the law. Except that what he said is being recorded as a new book. So then it says in Deuteronomy 31:9, so Moses wrote this law and delivered it to the priests, the sons of Levi. And we can also look at Deuteronomy 31, 22, and 24. Again, the book of Deuteronomy and all those places attests to the fact that Moses was the author. Okay, let's take a look at some other Old Testament references, okay? If you turn to 1 Kings chapter 2. 1 Kings chapter 2. I just realized we didn't open up with prayer today. Okay, let's go ahead and open with a word of prayer first. Keenan, you want to open us in prayer?
Sure.
Okay.
Lord, I thank you for this day that you've given us. I just pray that you open our minds to learn about the book of Deuteronomy, and that you bless Jim and his teaching today. In Jesus' name, amen.
Okay. First Kings chapter 2, verse 3. Would anybody like to read that? 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 3.
I'll read it. And keep charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his judgments, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn.
So you notice that term, the law of Moses, okay? And so it gives you an Old Testament feel for, in other words, the Old Testament's quoting the Old Testament. Remember, originally these were all separate books. I mean, they obviously it's all put together as one book for us, but remember there's 39 books in the Old Testament, or say 24 books in the Hebrew Old Testament, because we took some of those books and we cut them in half. Like 1st and 2nd Kings used to just be Kings. 1st and 2nd Samuel used to just be Samuel. 1st and 2nd Chronicles just used to be Chronicles. So, but for us, for the way that we look at the Old Testament, there's 39 books. So that we do have books of the Bible validating other sections of the Bible, because it's one book quoting another book. Okay. Sometimes in apologetics, people will say, "Well, you guys are so imbecile. You know, you're stuck in circular reasoning. You know, you say the Bible is true, and then you quote the Bible to prove the Bible." And they're saying, well, you can't do that because the Bible's only one book. That's what the critics would say. But you could answer, no, actually the Bible is not one book. It is a collection of books written over a period of 1,200 years in 3 languages on 3 continents. And there's a total of 66 books in the Bible. And so if Paul quotes Jeremiah, or if Paul quotes Moses or something like that, it's not circular reasoning. It's just that we have a collection of books that we call the Scripture, And of course, there's one divine author, but 40 plus human authors. So when one author quotes another author, it's not circular reasoning. So if you quote the Bible to prove the Bible, it doesn't mean it's circular reasoning. For instance, I like to mention lots of times, I do it in a joking way. Paul mentions in, like, say, Romans 10:13, whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. He is quoting Joel 2:32, chapter 2, verse 32. And Paul, not being a student of Generation Bible College, did not even reference his quote as to who said it first. Paul plagiarized Joel and thought he could get away with it, but we've nailed him here in this class, right? Okay. There's just an example. In other words, Paul quoted Joel, whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. So even though Paul didn't reference Joel as being the person who said that, at least who said it first, by the way, Peter plagiarized him too in Acts chapter 2. But it was a different book. It was a different author of a particular book quoting another source, which at that time was the book of Joel.
Jim,
Yes.
what if they immediately recognize, at least because it's like their heritage and they would have to know the law, or at least most of them, or the books, they would like know this from Joel?
Yeah, I mean, if you grew up Jewish or something like that, and you went to Hebrew school or something like that, and you had religion class, you would be learning the books of the Hebrew Bible and stuff. And so they would know, but again, it's a collection of books, but it's put into one book, which we call the Bible. So, 2 Kings 14:6, and also 2 Kings 18, verse 12. These are like Old Testament references that, in other words, attribute the law, specifically Deuteronomy, as being from Moses. So anyway, there's New Testament references also. For instance, Acts chapter 3, verses 22 and 23 quotes Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 and 18. Romans 10:19 quotes Deuteronomy 32:21. Would it be good if I put those on the board? Or? Okay. Okay, Acts 3:22 and 3. That means I got to erase the board again. Okay. Okay. By the way, remember, this was on your midterm, some of this stuff. Like give some New Testament references that quote, the Pentateuch. Okay. Okay. What's that?
That Deuteronomy 18:5.
Oh, that's pretty messed up, isn't it? 18. Yeah. So, for instance, in those passages, they are quoting directly from the book of Deuteronomy. So I'm going to let's look at Romans, actually Acts 3:22. That's the closest one. In Acts 3:22. So in your Bible, turn to Acts 3:22. We'll have a break really soon. So in Acts 3:22 and 23, it states, "For Moses truly said to the fathers, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren. Him you shall hear in all things whatever he says to you. And it shall be that every soul who will not hear that prophet shall be utterly destroyed from among the people. So that's a direct quote of Deuteronomy chapter 18 when it's talking about a prophet like unto Moses. Okay. So in other words, it's a direct quote from the law. So also in verse 22, anyway, we could go back to Deuteronomy and you'd see that it was just quoting the same thing. So after Moses' death, this is important to note. Okay, like in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 48 through 34:12, which states that the Lord Jehovah is telling Moses that it was time for him to die. Like 32, 48 to 50. God's saying it's time to die, and then Moses dies. Obviously, Moses is not recording his own death and what happened after he died. That's not being recorded. So the author at that point is, the evidence seems to show that Joshua was the writer of the last couple of chapters. Deuteronomy 32:48, all the way through 34:12. Joshua is said to be the writer. He's the one that recorded for all posterity the death of Moses. Okay, let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. So let's take a look at the date of the writing, and when we were at this. Oh, is the camera on? Okay. When we started this class on the Pentateuch weeks ago, remember we talked about the documentary hypothesis? I'm going to mention something else about it in a little bit, but I want to go by, first of all, what the Bible itself has to say about the date of the writing. So it says, the first day of the 11th month of the 40th year after the Exodus from Egypt. That's Deuteronomy 1:3. That basically tells you when Moses is giving this address. So if you look at the very beginning in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 3, it gives a date. It came to pass in the 40th year, in the 11th month, on the first day of the month. Remember I said, Deuteronomy, basically it's all being given in just a 1-month period in our timeline. So if we draw our timeline, which we are going to do, and I guarantee you, remember it's on your paper that you're writing about, but it's going to be on your final also. So just looking at our 40 years in the wilderness, here's crossing the Red Sea. Remember, that's when Israel crossed the Red Sea. All the way, and then here's entering the land. "40 years. Now remember, this 40 years spans all the way from the crossing of the Red Sea, which is in Exodus 14, all the way to entering the land, which is basically Joshua chapter 1, verse 1. But the time in the wilderness basically goes just basically to the end of Deuteronomy. And here's the 40th. Let's just call this the 40th year. And like say, there's 39 years. It had been 39 years since they crossed the Red Sea. 39 years and 11 months. Well, in that 40th year, how many months are in a year? 12. So, so in this little section right here, right at the end of that 40th year, the last month of the 40th year, this little section right in here in red. Remember, this is the 40th year from here to here, and in the 12th month, right there, in that 30-day period. You know, there's 30 days in a Hebrew month. In that very last period, that's when Deuteronomy was written. Yes?
My Bible says the 11th month for some reason.
I'm sorry, what did I say?
The 12th month.
Let's see what mine says. Okay, it says, now it came to pass in the 40th year, and you're right, in the 11th month on the first day. I stand corrected. You know what I like to say when somebody does that? I say, nail him to the wall if he makes a mistake. So it doesn't go there. That little red thing goes here. It says the first day of the 11th month, right? Okay. Thank you, Oscar, for bringing that up. It means I've been lying to you, for like weeks. Well, let's just say I haven't been speaking the truth, but I have been corrected. I've been nailed to the wall. Okay. Okay. I'm supposed to laugh when I do something. Okay. Okay. So the first day of the 11th month of the 40th year after the Exodus from Egypt. So this computes to January or February 1405 BC. So the date here is 1405 BC. And at the end of that year, of course, they're going to enter the land, right? They're going to, the few things that go on in the book of Joshua, and then, of course, they're going into the land. So Moses is 120 years old, and it is written the last month of his life. Because after he finishes Deuteronomy, basically God says, Moses, time to die. That's a paraphrase, by the way. God doesn't say it in quite that way. Okay.
Was Moses pretty old, like his characteristics, or was it kind of young? Do you know? Is there any scriptures that say that?
Yes, there is, as a matter of fact, and I'll get to it.
Okay.
Okay? But that is absolutely correct. When Moses, in fact, I've been trying to decide whether I should really describe Moses at the end of his life, what he was like. But I think maybe I'll give it an attempt. I was trying to think of what's proper in the class. I guess I'll just go ahead and tell you what it means, okay? Okay. Now let's look at the liberal critical view of when the book was written. We have Deuteronomy itself telling you when it was written, right? The 40th year of the Exodus, which puts it from our perspective, puts it in 1405 BC in the 11th month of the last year. In other words, 10 months of the 40th year have already passed. There's only 2 months left of the year. Okay. Liberal scholars have never agreed on who they think wrote the book of Moses, the books of Moses. Sounds like an oxymoron. They don't know who wrote the Pentateuch, or especially the book of Deuteronomy, except that most agree we don't know who wrote the book, but one thing we do know. It wasn't Moses. That's what they say.
Moses didn't like the books of Moses.
And the critical scholarships say that Moses did not write the books. Remember, there was no writing back in that day. Moses couldn't have written the Pentateuch because there was no writing in that day. That was their original premise. So most critics say it was written in the 7th century BC. Now we're speaking specifically about the book of Deuteronomy. So they're saying, the critics are saying the 7th century. In other words, the year 600. In other words, like 720, 750. In other words, in the 7th century BC. Okay, here is the critics' reasoning for at least. I'm going to give you 2 reasons why the critics say that the book of Deuteronomy was written in in the 7th century, rather than the 14th century BC. In other words, the critics are saying that the book was written at least 700 years later than what the book claims. In other words, they're saying that when the Bible itself tells you when it was written, like in the book of Deuteronomy, they're saying that's a pious fraud. That's what the liberal Christian scholars say. Okay, and I'm going to give you 2 out of 4 reasons on why they believe this. Okay, I could pick a lot of reasons, but these 2 are the easiest to understand. One reason for the 7th century BC date was the discovery of the book of the law in the temple during Josiah's reign, 2 Kings 22. So if we turn back to 2 Kings 22. Okay, I'm going to just read part of the chapter here. Now remember, you got to think, the critics don't believe the book of Deuteronomy. Remember, no, they don't believe Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, or Deuteronomy, but their reasoning being they're using Scripture to try to disprove the Scripture. In other words, they're taking something out of 2 Kings chapter 22, and they're using it as a proof text to demonstrate that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, like the Bible claims, like Jesus claimed and everything else. So it says in chapter 22, it says, Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jedidah, the daughter of Adiah of Bozkath. Okay, and it says, and he did what was right in the sight of the Lord and walked in all the ways of his father David. He did not turn aside to the right hand or to the left. It came to pass, verse 3, in the 18th year of King Josiah, that the king sent Shaphan the scribe, the son of Azaliah, the son of Meshullam, to the house of Jehovah, saying, Go up to Hilkiah the high priest, that he may count the money which has been brought into the house of the Lord, which the doorkeepers have gathered from the people, and let them deliver it into the hand of those doing the work, who are the overseers in the house of Jehovah. Let them give it to those who are in the house of Jehovah, etc., 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 down to verse 7. However, there need be no accounting made with them of the money delivered into their hand, because they deal faithfully. Verse 8, a key verse. Then Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the scribe, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, and he read it. Okay, so what they find is the book of the law. Now the critics assume it's the book of Deuteronomy. You notice 2 Kings 22, it doesn't tell them it was the book of Deuteronomy. It just says it was the book of the law, the law of Moses. You would read that and you would say they found the Pentateuch. In other words, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. They found the scroll. Okay, that's what the Bible itself says they found. The critics said they just only found the book of Deuteronomy. Where they get that, you got to ask the critics, because nobody agrees. No, they're in total disagreement on a lot of the facts. The only thing, again, that they're absolutely sure of is that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, and specifically here that he did not write Deuteronomy. So they assumed the book of the law referred to in Deuteronomy, and that it had been written in the name of Moses. In other words, the fact that the Bible claimed it was written by Moses, the critics say it's a pious fraud. In other words, it is an outright lie. Moses didn't write that book. That's what they're saying. And by the way, these are quote-unquote Christians. It's liberal Christianity. Remember, they don't believe the Scripture, and they spend most of their time trying to tear it apart. Anyway, here's what they claim. They claim that Josiah himself, because remember Josiah had a lot of reforms that he did. In other words, he cleaned up the temple. He got rid of idolatry to the best that he could in Judah and lots of areas in the northern kingdom. In other words, he cleansed the land. Well, in order to give him the authority to do what he wanted to do, he hired somebody to write the book of Deuteronomy. With all the reforms that he wanted in the book, with associated penalties and all that stuff if these things weren't done. In other words, he wrote all that. And then he hid it in the temple, sent in Hilkiah the high priest so that he could find it and quote unquote discover it and read a law that nobody had known about for a long time. That's what the critics say. So in other words, it was a fraud. It was a trick to fool everybody into so that they would do all the community projects and reforming the government and reforming the land like he wanted to do. He had to give it some sort of scriptural authority, so he wrote a book, lied about it, saying that Moses wrote it. That's what the critics say.
Don't say never.
But that's what they say. And by the way, they still teach that in seminaries and Bible colleges and stuff. Okay, that's one of the reasons, okay? Now, there's actually four main reasons, but one other reason, let me give you an extra reason. There's no place in the law where it says that they are to meet in Jerusalem. In other words, when the feasts are celebrated by Israel 3 times a year, they're supposed to come to Jerusalem. In the law, God says to an appointed place. Well, remember, Josiah was trying to get rid of all the high places. In other words, they were sacrificing on every hill, and they were worshiping different gods and stuff like that. And in order to control religion, to control the religion of the people, he was saying everybody has to meet right here where I can keep my eye on you. So by writing the book of Deuteronomy, he could kind of sort of say that God would appoint a place for everybody to meet, which would be in Jerusalem. So in other words, they're saying that he did it for that reason too. So people would meet in Jerusalem, that way he had better control of the people by controlling their religion. In other words, he was using religion to control the people. So in other words, they're saying that he was a fake all the way around. He was a charlatan, a religious fake, everything. Okay, it was all just a put on, just a big show for the people so that he could get control of the country. Now, the last reason I want to mention is Deuteronomy includes several predictions of the dispersion and subsequent regathering of Israel. Now, the critics will also say that the book was written, it could have been written even much later than that. And since the critics do not believe that the Bible has a supernatural source, in other words, they believe that man wrote it, and somewhere in it, the Word of God comes out in the writings of man. But because there is predictive prophecy in Deuteronomy, they're saying that it was written after the fact. Like for instance, in the book of Daniel was written about 550, 586, 600 BC in that area, but the critics say Daniel was written around 163 BC.
Because they don't believe it.
Because, yeah, they said there are so many prophecies that detail the flow of Greek history and world history and everything. How could Daniel possibly know that the Medes and the Persians would follow after Babylon, and then how could Daniel possibly know that the Greeks would follow after them and then Rome after them? How could Daniel possibly know that? Obviously, because Daniel was written after the fact.
So they basically completely take out the supernatural element of the Bible.
Yes. There is no supernatural. And by the way, that goes into the New Testament too. What is the miracle of the feeding of the 4,000 and the 5,000? Jesus sees all of these people out there and they're hungry, and he notices that some people have food and some don't. So the people who had food, they weren't sharing. They were being selfish. They just brought enough for themselves. And what Jesus did was he was able to shame the people to such a point that everybody who had food shared their food with those who didn't have food. So the great miracle was that everybody shared their food, so everybody was able to eat. In other words, God didn't multiply loaves of bread and fishes. In other words, God didn't create them on the spot, or Jesus didn't create them right on the spot. Basically, Jesus got people to share. Totally takes out the supernatural character of those two New Testament miracles, the feeding of the 4,000 and 5,000, where Jesus literally created fish and bread out of nothing. Again, because they don't believe in the supernatural character. If you don't believe in a supernatural, if you don't believe in God, or that God, if you do believe in God, but you don't believe that God does anything supernatural, that he must only obey the natural laws, then you've got to come up with some explanation for predictive prophecy. How do you explain predictive prophecy unless you late date it and say, well, you're just writing about something that's already happened? So in essence, then they give it a late date. So it was written after the fact. Okay, that's the second reason I wanted to give you for the liberals' viewpoint on when Deuteronomy was written, basically because there's predictive prophecy, so it had to have been written later. Because there's prophecies in there that hadn't happened yet. If Moses wrote Deuteronomy, then there's stuff in Deuteronomy which hasn't happened yet. Because Moses talked about two great dispersions. He said they were going to be taken captive by a powerful nation, but they would return to the land. But then because of continued unbelief, they would be taken captive again, and they would be scattered into all the nations of the world. And then in the latter years, latter days, be brought back into the land. It says that in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy also has a verse that talks about getting our new heart, the new covenant. It first shows up with Moses in the law. And then he also talked about the regathering of Israel, and he talks about the Great Tribulation. There's one verse in Deuteronomy that talks about the Great Tribulation, the time of great distress that comes upon the Israelites in the latter days, towards the end of time. And so obviously, if the author knew about those things, they had to have already happened. So that's their reasoning there. They just don't believe that Moses couldn't have written it. Number one, first of all, there was no writing, and there's predictive prophecy in it. And Josiah, being a crooked politician, wanted to have his way, so he had a book written, claimed it was a book of Moses, and that we needed to do what this book said. In other words, they're saying that Josiah was a crooked politician, and the book of Deuteronomy is a complete fraud.
If they don't believe in the supernatural or anything like that, it just was written by man. How do they cope with Jesus and him dying and being resurrected? How can they? I don't understand. How can they call them Christians and deny all that?
How can they believe in God in itself?
Yeah.
Yeah, and you might ask, why are they even ministers? Well, remember, Satan has his people in the church to destroy the church from the inside. Not only is the doctrine of creation, but for instance, you realize that over 90% of all ministers of the gospel don't believe in a literal second coming of Christ? Mm-hmm. They don't believe it. It's over 90%. When I was in the Episcopal Church, I had one priest, he said, I don't believe that Jesus Christ is literally coming back again in the body, but he says, but I believe that Jesus comes again and again and again for a second time, spiritually, when you have an encounter with Jesus and you feel very spiritual, or you read the Bible and you feel very good, that's Jesus coming back for the second coming. In other words, they've negated everything that the Scripture says. And so that's what the critics are doing. When I was in I was a Calvary pastor in Sonoma, California. We met in the women's club. Right across on the next block, actually in the same block, but just around the corner, in the Sonoma Community Center, sometimes the Jesus Seminar would meet. And I don't know if you know them, but they were the group of extremely intellectual liberal scholars who basically were going through the Gospels, and they were determining like say you have a red letter edition of your Bible and all the words of Jesus are in red, they were taking those words and they were trying to decide which of those words did Jesus really say and which of them were made up later on by his followers. And so basically they had 3 marbles. They'd have, say, like a black marble, a white marble, and a gray marble. If Jesus didn't say it, if they were convinced that Jesus couldn't have said what the Bible says he said, they voted it down and said Jesus didn't say that. If they weren't sure, or like maybe he could have said it, they'd vote with gray. And they said if he actually really did say it, they voted with the white marble. And of course, when they were done, what they had left of the Gospels there wasn't much left. Because anytime they dealt with a miracle or something like that, obviously that didn't happen, so they threw all those things out. So the Jesus that they were, in other words, they were trying to come to who is the historical Jesus? Who is the real Jesus? And of course, when we read the Bible, we get a completely different idea of who Jesus is. Well, this kind of criticism runs literally through all the books of the Bible, and Deuteronomy is a book that is especially attacked because if you remember, Deuteronomy is what Christ quoted from 3 times when he was defending himself against the devil during the temptations in the wilderness. 40 days in the wilderness that Jesus spent, neither eating or drinking, and then Satan comes to him. And when Satan attacked him, Jesus defended himself with the Word of God, but he exclusively used the book of Deuteronomy. So Satan has a special hatred for the book of Deuteronomy. And so there's a lot of criticism from the critics even today about the book of Deuteronomy, about it being a fraud, about it not being authentic, about Moses not writing it. In other words, there's been a lot of sustained attacks against the book of Deuteronomy. So that's what the critics have to say, okay? But of course, the scripture itself says that Moses wrote it. In other words, Deuteronomy itself says that Moses wrote it. In 1st and 2nd Kings, we read that the kings themselves said that Moses wrote the law. And then it says, in the New Testament that Moses wrote the law, specifically Deuteronomy. So in other words, if you believe what the Bible says, other places in the Old Testament and the New Testament, you have to believe that that the Deuteronomy was a book of Moses, and that it was written in 1405 BC. If you don't believe that, you have a greater problem, because your real problem is you don't believe what Jesus said. Because Jesus is going to quote from Deuteronomy numerous times. Any questions so far? Okay. So, excuse me. Deuteronomy is like Leviticus, okay? Deuteronomy does not advance the story of Israel chronologically. Remember when we did that chronological thing on the board? Say you have the book of Genesis, and just say 2,300 years. And then you have Exodus, and then you have Numbers. Exodus, you could give 2,300 years. A book of Exodus, you could give like say 431 years. 430 years in slavery in Egypt, okay? And then the 1 year from Exodus 12 all the way to Exodus 40. And then in Numbers, you remember, it's 39 years. Going all the way to here. But the book of Deuteronomy, just like Leviticus, like for instance Leviticus, Leviticus is written during this period here. Actually, it's written in that last year right here of the book of Exodus. Remember, it takes 3 months to get to Mount Sinai, and then they're there for another 9 months. And during that time, during the first year of the Exodus, Leviticus is written, that last 9 months of the first year in the wilderness. So Leviticus doesn't advance chronologically. It's just what was being written while they were in the wilderness. And then, of course, Numbers goes all the way in, but then Deuteronomy is written in that last year.
I thought Deuteronomy was written in the last month.
Yeah, but it is the last month. I'm just rounding it off and saying it was written in the last year.
Okay.
But it was written in the 11th month of the 40th year. So in other words, Leviticus and Deuteronomy, they don't move the story along chronologically, because they're documents talking about laws and stuff like that. They're not talking about events that are taking place in time, like say Numbers and Exodus and Genesis does. Like Genesis, you go from creation all the way to the death of Joseph. And like say, pretty close to 2,400 years in that area. Although don't quote me on that on the test. But use your proof, like on your handout that you got. So it does not advance the story of Israel chronologically, but takes place entirely in one location over about a month of time. In other words, over a period of just 1 month, the book of Deuteronomy is written. While they are there, basically they're going to be on the plains of Moab. Leviticus was written at the foot of Mount Sinai. The book of Deuteronomy is written on the plains of Moab, right across from the Jordan River in Jericho. It's all written right there while the Israelites are encamped there, getting ready to go into the land. Bless you. Gesundheit.
God bless you.
Okay, so if we look at Deuteronomy chapter 1, okay, let me just kind of clean this up a little bit. Here's our 40 years. In the first year, I've kind of got this first year stretched out, okay? It took, here's the Red Sea crossing. After the Red Sea crossing, I'm going to divide this year into months, okay? It took the Israelites 3 months to get to Mount Sinai. 3 months. And so for the rest of the year, 3 plus 9 equals 12 months. Y'all see that? Y'all see that? So during that time, during that 9-month period, this period right here, the book of Leviticus is written. During that 9-month period. And again, they are at Mount Sinai. So, if I was going to ask you where was Leviticus written, not when, but if I said where, what would you say? At the foot of Mount Sinai. Well, now in the very last year, so here's the last year. So here's the 11th month. Okay, of the 40th year. This is the first year. Here's the 40th year. In the 11th month, okay. Deuteronomy tells us, that's when Deuteronomy is being written. But in verse 5 of chapter 1, it states, on this side of the Jordan in the land of Moab, Moses began to explain this law, saying, so chapter 1, verse 5, basically, if I was going to ask you where was Deuteronomy written, not when, but where, basically you would say the plains of Moab. And it even describes it as being directly across from the Jordan River, Jericho being on the other side of the Jordan River. So, Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1. These are the words which Moses spoke to all Israel on this side of the Jordan in the wilderness, in the plain opposite Suf, between Paran, Tophel, Lavan, Hazarot, and Dizahab. It is 11 days journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. Okay, so he's telling you when it's written. And then verse 3. Now it came to pass in the 40th year, in the 11th month, on the first day of the month. So that's the time. Okay. And then it says in verse 5, on this side of the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moses began to explain this law. In other words, now Moses is now going to, he's here in the 40th year on the plains of Moab. Here's a little map of Israel here. Of the Promised Land. Here's the Sea of Galilee. Here's the Jordan River. Here's the Dead Sea. Here's Jericho. This is the country of Moab on this side. This is the country of Canaan on this side. And all the Israelites are encamped right here. Israel's encamped right there on the east side of the Jordan River, and they can see Jericho on the other side and stuff like that. So Israel is here at this point in the 40th year. So Leviticus was written at the foot of Mount Sinai. Deuteronomy is being written on the plains of Moab in the 40th year. Leviticus is written in the first year. Deuteronomy is written in the 40th year. But what's Moses doing? Moses is now taking Leviticus, Leviticus, Exodus, and what's in the book of Numbers, all those places where you read laws, where you're told what to do, what not to do and stuff. And in the book of Leviticus, Moses is now explaining the law to the new generation. The law that is given in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers is being explained in Deuteronomy before they enter the land. And in other words, it's like if I talked about a bunch of laws, and then say last week I talked about a bunch of laws, and then today, I'm going to talk about those laws again and ask for questions. And I'll be forced to give explanations for what you didn't understand here or something like that. It's just that here there's like a 38-year difference, almost 39 years difference in time. So this new generation might have questions. So God is explaining the law in the Deuteronomy. You don't understand the book of Leviticus and Exodus and stuff? Let me tell you about it in Deuteronomy. I'll expand exactly what I'm talking about. That's what he does in Deuteronomy, and that's on the plains of Moab. Okay, so you got that? So anyway, that's when Deuteronomy was written and where it was written. So Israel was encamped in the central Rift Valley to the east of the Jordan River. When you read Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1, basically that's what it's describing. And it's referred to as the plains of Moab, as an area north of the Arnon River across the Jordan River from Jericho. So you could actually pull out a map of the Middle East back at that time. You can see exactly where the Israelites were encamped. Okay. So then who are the recipients of Deuteronomy? I mean, who is God talking to? Yes. The second generation, absolutely. So this is the second generation, those people from 40 to 60 years of age. How about the people older than that? Where are they? Dead. They died in the wilderness. So most or many of them had been born in Egypt. Like, for instance, if you were 60 years old and you've been in the wilderness for 40 years, you were born in Egypt. And say, like, maybe you were a teenager when you left Egypt. Let's just say this entire class here, all of you are 10 and 11 years old. Well, you'd be entering the Promised Land if you survived the plagues and God's judgment during the 40-year trek in the wilderness, surviving on manna and all that stuff for 40 years. Say you're 10, because of your ages here, you're 10 or 11 when you leave Egypt. How old does that make you when you enter the Promised Land?
52.
Yeah, 51, 52.
Going into the wheelchair.
Me and my grandkids are going in too.
But remember, Joshua was 80 years old, and he said he was just as sprightly and strong and vigorous and healthy as he was when he was 40, when he was a spy in the land. So 50 years old in that culture back then in the desert where God was supernaturally preserving you to go into the wilderness, at 50 years old you look pretty good. You weren't dressed as nicely as you are today. You've been wearing the same pair of shoes for 40 years. And you look at them, they never wore out. They look at their sandals, they just didn't wear out. By the way, that's in Deuteronomy too. Also, Deuteronomy also. So most or many of them had been born in Egypt and had crossed the Red Sea as children or teenagers. By the way, and if you were 20 or older when you crossed the Red Sea, bad news, right? If you're not Joshua or Caleb, bad news, you're not going to make it in the Promised Land because you rebelled against God. But as it was, you're a teenager and you watched your parents rebel against God, so God killed your parents in the wilderness. In other words, let them die in the wilderness, but you get to go into the Promised Land. Many were born in the wilderness and grew up with no first-hand experience of Egypt. For instance, if you're 20 years old or 21 or 25 or something like that, you were born in the wilderness when Israel had been wandering in the wilderness for 15 years. You were born there, so you don't know anything about Egypt. You don't know anything about Canaan. All you know of is wilderness. The only food you've ever eaten your whole life is manna. Isn't that all there is? You know, I mean, if you're born in the wilderness in that time, all you've ever had to eat is manna. You've heard people talk about vegetables and fruit and eating meat, and basically, well, I've heard of that, but I don't know what that stuff is. I have no experience with it. I've never had a grapefruit or a banana or a watermelon or a carrot or an onion. I've heard of those things, but I don't know what they taste like. I don't know what they look like. I mean, because there's no pictures, you would have people describing it to you. But I mean, all you can think of is manna.
That'd be so cool when they went in the land and ate all that food.
Yeah, it's like,
Their stomachs are probably jacked up.
yeah, it's like, what is this stuff, you know?
Lamb chop?
Yeah. But think, if you had been born in the wilderness, all you would have known your entire life is manna. All you knew was, you know, that
And quail.
on one occasion, yeah. Yeah, absolutely correct. But what if you were born after that?
Then
Yeah.
you would just know that.
Yeah. So you only like heard about that stuff. You'd see a bird fly over the wilderness, and you'd say, I heard people eat those things. You know, if they can catch them. But we don't. All you would have known is that you just pick your food up off the ground.
Wasn't there like fruits and stuff in the trees in the wilderness?
No. By definition, the wilderness was an area with no trees, very little vegetation. Basically, God delivered several hundred tons of manna every day.
Like just desert.
Yeah, not a forest, guys.
It would be like,
Basically.
yes.
So since they were in the middle of the desert, would that have stopped like other nations from coming and warring against them during that time?
Yes. Not only God putting a shield around them and protecting them, but for instance, if I say put some of you in Barstow, you all know where Barstow's at? In the middle of Mojave Desert. If I put you out there and I asked you to walk to Los Angeles or something like that, you might make it 20 or 30 miles and you'd be dead. No water. So basically, they were protected by the environment. God gave them water. Remember, God had to supply the water in the wilderness. He had to supply their food. And any other nation coming in, if they would have wanted to make war against them, they couldn't. But remember, God had gone out of his way to destroy the Egyptian army, so Egypt wasn't a threat anymore. They couldn't survive in the wilderness. And the people in Canaan, same reason, they couldn't survive in the wilderness. They couldn't bring in enough water and all that stuff. So God protected them. In other words, the wilderness, the desert area was a barrier that kept other people out. Plus God supernaturally just protecting them, his presence being there. So if you were born in the wilderness, you would have thought, doesn't everybody see God? Doesn't everybody have a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night? Doesn't the rest of humanity have a God that just shows them which way to go? Because
People
remember,
walked that far pregnant?
huh?
People walked that far pregnant?
Yeah.
They're a beast.
One of the things that in Exodus chapter 1, when Pharaoh wanted to kill the firstborn males because Israel was going so fast, the complaint about that the midwives gave to Pharaoh was, these Hebrew women are so vigorous, they're so strong, that by the time we hear they're pregnant and they're having their baby, we get out there and they've already had their baby. You know, so it's just like they're out there working the fields, time for delivery, they squat down, they have a baby, and they just go back to work. That's what the midwives were saying. And then they said, they're not dainty and weak like you Egyptian women. That's what they said. These Hebrew women, they're vigorous and strong.
It doesn't happen that way. just so you know.
Yep. So in other words, God sustained them.
Oh, here goes another one.
Okay.
Twins.
Obviously not quite that easy, but remember God put them in the wilderness, he put them in Egypt so that they would grow as a nation, right?
Yeah, just keep popping.
Remember, they started with 70 people, and at the end of 400 years, they were 2 to 3 million. Okay. So the contents of Deuteronomy are addressed to the second generation. So there's a long verbal address communicating God's word to the people. There are only 3 other recorded events in the book of Deuteronomy. Moses recording the law in a book and commissioning Joshua as the new leader. That's one. Moses viewing the land of Canaan from Mount Nebo. And then there's an account of Moses' death.
How do you spell Nebo?
Nebo. Like Tim Tebow? Tebo. Yeah.
W.
Is it O? W?
Yeah.
When I was in Florida, he was in high school. He went to a high school in Jacksonville, Florida. Okay, let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break, and then we'll finish up with our introduction here. We got less than 1 hour, okay? So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, the historical setting for Deuteronomy. Everybody? Okay, I know those brownies. I know those cupcakes muffins are good.
No frosting. Definitely a muffin.
Oh, okay. It used to be, if it wasn't frosting, why eat it? Because I only ate it for the frosting. Okay, let's look at the historical setting of Deuteronomy. You all ready? In Deuteronomy, the emphasis is on the people. Moses is speaking to the people about keeping the law. In Leviticus, the emphasis was on the priests. In other words, how they're going to implement the law. Leviticus is about the priests. Deuteronomy emphasizes the people who have to obey the laws. Everybody understand that? Okay. So the span of time Deuteronomy describes, let's take a look at that. Moses looked back at Israel's past history. In other words, he starts off and he's going to talk to them. It's the second generation, and he's going to review some of their past history of what happened in the wilderness. So he talks about the rebellion of the Lord at Horeb in Deuteronomy chapter 9, verses 10 through 11. And then at Kadesh, chapter 1, verses 26 through 46, that rebellion, it brought devastating consequences. Moses was going back to Numbers chapter 13 and 14, where the first generation refused to go into the land. And Moses is reviewing that time period with them because they're getting ready to enter the land. And so he reminds them about what your mommy and daddy did. He says, don't do like your mother and father They're dead in the wilderness. They refuse to go into the land. He's telling them, don't be like them. And so he tells them about he reviews the history of what happened back then. Remember, a lot of the second generation, they weren't even alive at that time. They were born after the fact. If they were teenagers or something like that and they crossed the Red Sea, then they can remember the rebellion. If they were young children, they just faintly remember that, I heard when I was a kid that we were supposed to go in the land, and then we didn't go in the land. We turned around and went into the wilderness. Moses is reminding them of why it happened. When they rebelled against God, Moses wanted to inscribe upon their minds about how devastating those consequences were to the first generation. Every last one of them, except Joshua and Caleb, had to die in the wilderness. So, for instance, in Deuteronomy chapter 1, I just want to pull out a couple of key verses here. Starting about verse 34, the penalty for, let's look at Israel's refusal to enter the land. It starts about verse 19. He says in verse 19, so we departed from Horeb and went through all that great and terrible wilderness which you saw on the way to the mountains of the Amorites, as Jehovah our God had commanded us. Then we came to Kadesh Barnea, and I said to you, you have come to the mountains of the Amorites, which the Lord your God is giving us. And then, of course, remember, now they're going to choose spies to check out the land. The spies come back, and then remember the people, verse 28, where can we go up? Our brethren have discouraged our hearts, saying, quote, the people are greater and taller than we. The cities are great and fortified up to heaven. Moreover, we have seen the sons of the Anakim there. Remember the long-necked people. They looked at the population and said, wow, those guys are over 10 feet tall. And they really meant they were over 10 feet tall. Of course, they would have measured them in cubits. They said we were as grasshoppers in their sight. Remember the explanation numbers? We looked at those guys and they were giants. We looked at the women and the women dwarfed us. They were like we barely came up to the middle of their chest for the women. They were head and shoulders taller than us. In other words, if the men were 10 to 12 feet tall, the women were at least 9 to 10 feet tall. Some really big ladies, and the Israelite warriors, they're just much shorter. So they were terrified. They saw the Anakim. Then I said to you, do not be terrified or afraid of them. The Lord your God who goes before you, he will fight for you according to all that he did. Remember, but they didn't believe what Moses said. So the penalty for Israel's rebellion for refusing to go into the land, he says, remember, and this is just a review of that first generation. Why is he talking about this? He talked about the first generation because they're getting ready to do the same thing that the first generation did. The first generation was there, ready to go into the land. They refused to go in. Now the second generation is poised. They've just received the law, or they're receiving the law, and they're getting ready to enter the land. And so now Moses tells them what happened to your parents 39 years before. So it says, and Jehovah heard the sound of your words and was angry and took an oath, saying, surely not one of these men of this evil generation shall see that good land of which I swore to give to your fathers, except Caleb the son of Jephunneh. He shall see it, and to him and his children I am giving the land on which he walked, because he wholly followed the Lord. The Lord was also angry with me, now Moses is talking about himself, for your sakes, saying, even you shall not go in there. Joshua the son of Nun, who stands before you, he shall go in there. Encourage him, for he shall cause Israel to inherit it. And then he says, moreover, your little ones, now that's the generation grown up, your little ones and your children, who you say will be victims, who today have no knowledge of good and evil, in other words, they're under the age of accountability, they shall go in there, to them I will give it, and they shall possess it. But as for you, turn and take your journey in the wilderness by the way of the Red Sea. So in other words, they rebelled against God. The consequences were so devastating. They didn't get to enter the land, and they were doomed to die in the wilderness. And all the children who were under the age of accountability, God said, I will bring them in. So now that generation of kids has grown up. And they're getting ready to enter the land. So God is warning them, don't do what your parents did. Or maybe your grandparents. Don't do what they did.
Lauren died in the wilderness.
What's that?
She died in the wilderness.
That's right. You were one of the older ones, huh? Yeah.
Barely made it. Bachelors to the rapture.
Okay.
In the
What?
Okay.
Too far.
Okay. So when they refused to go into the land, God's sentence was 40 years in the wilderness, or up to that point, they were going to spend 38 more years in the wilderness. So anyway, but God also talks about Israel's faithfulness. There was times when Israel was faithful when they were in the wilderness. So in chapter 2 and in chapter 3, God talks about how they defeated King Sihon. Okay, he defeated King Sihon, and they defeated King Og. Remember, King Og, they were already, by this time, they're giant killers. On the east side of the Jordan, they're killing giants. Og was, remember, he's the guy with a 13-foot bed. Yeah. And so, in other words, there was a whole race of giants. And basically, the Israelites wiped them out. And they were on the east side of the Jordan. So, I mean, they ate giants for breakfast. What's that?
The Giants ate giants for breakfast?
No, the Israelites they ate giants for breakfast. It's a expression. They didn't I can't say that on the camera, but yes, they soundly defeated and executed the enemy. Who happened to be giants.
Sit on their loser shit
Yes.
and kick their feet.
Yeah.
Literally.
Okay. Then Moses gets to their present history. Their present history, which is to take the land of Canaan. That's what's next. Pay attention. Okay. Okay. Take the land of Canaan. Okay. Okay. In other words, God had promised by oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that he was going to give them the land. So in Genesis 15, 18 to 21, that's the promise to Abraham. Chapters 26, 3 through 5, that's the promise to Isaac. Jacob was promised the land in Genesis 35, 12. And God highlights that in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 8, 6, verse 10, 9, verse 5, 29, verse 13, chapter 30, verse 20, and chapter 34, verse 4. God is highlighting the fact that this present generation is going to inherit the land. In other words, they're going to go in and take it. I've given you the land, but that's when God says that, it's a little bit different. However, you have to fight for it. But what God means is you'll win. I've guaranteed that you'll win. In other words, God has stacked the deck. He says you can't, all you got to do is go into the land and you're going to be victorious. You'll fight, and you'll fight hard, but you'll be successful. I will, when you pick up a sword and you take it against those giants and stuff like that, you will be the one that will strike them first before they can strike you. Then Moses takes a look at Israel's future. This is what the critics don't like. Israel's future failure to obey God would lead to her being scattered among the nations before the fulfillment of his oath to the patriarchs would be completed. In other words, Israel will take the land, but then they're going to be unfaithful, and God's going to have to, not once, but twice, have to kick them out of their own land. And in Deuteronomy chapter 28, God basically says a powerful nation is going to take you, but you'll come back after a short time. But then because you're still living in unbelief, I will kick you out again, and you'll be scattered to the four winds of heaven. Literally, you'll be scattered over the surface of the earth. The land itself will be devastated. The land of milk and honey will just be a big desert. In other words, I will devastate the land when you're gone, so hardly anybody else will live there. And like, for instance, if you read, Mark Twain, Samuel Langhorne, he took a trip to to Israel. And by the way, he's an atheist. But anyway, he went to the land of Canaan. He was an atheist, the guy that worked Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer and stuff. Being an atheist, but he still visited the land of Canaan. They called it Palestine at that time. And he described it as being a dried, parched out land in most of it where hardly a soul can live. And if you went north, the swamps and mosquitoes were so bad that if you survived the mosquitoes, you were lucky. I mean, as far as, them causing disease and stuff like that. He said the land was unlivable. In other words, Deuteronomy chapter 29 and 30, God said he would devastate the land so that hardly anybody could live there. The land supported less than 100,000 people, whereas back in this day and today it supports millions. But back in that day, it was no rain. The former rains and the latter rains, in other words, the spring rains and the fall rains, God just cut them off. It hardly rained at all for 2,000 years while they were out of the land. But Moses talks about that, okay? And I want to just read a portion of that in Deuteronomy chapter 28. First of all, he's going to talk about the Babylonian captivity. He doesn't name the Babylonians, but he's going to talk about them being dispersed this first time. And he states, "The Lord will bring you and the king whom you set over you to a nation which neither you nor your fathers have known, and there you shall serve other gods, wood and stone, and you shall become an astonishment, a proverb, and a byword among all nations where the Lord will drive you." So in other words, when Nebuchadnezzar came in, remember, it said they were going to, basically you're going to serve an idolatrous king. That's all you're going to have around you. And other nations will be astonished, okay? But because of continued unbelief, remember, 70-year captivity, they go back to the land. But remember, now they're going to be in the land. The scribes and the Pharisees arise during that 400-year period. And remember, the Messiah comes and they put him to death. So now he says, as far as they're being scattered worldwide again, he says in verse, last part of verse 63, "And you shall be plucked from off the land which you go to possess. Then the Lord will scatter you among all peoples from one end of the earth to the other." Now, think about that. From one end of the earth to the other. God is telling Moses what's going to happen to them 1,500 years in the future. In other words, 1,500 years in the future, he's saying that you will be scattered into all the nations of the earth. "And there you shall serve other gods, which neither you nor your fathers have known, wood and stone. And among those nations you shall find no rest, nor shall the sole of your foot have a resting place, but there the Lord will give you a trembling heart, failing eyes, and anguish of soul. Your life shall hang in doubt before you. You shall fear day and night, and have no assurance of life. In the morning you shall say, oh, that it were evening. And at evening you shall say, oh, that it were morning, because of the fear which terrifies your heart, and because of the sight which your eyes see. And the Lord will take you back to Egypt in ships, by the way of which I said to you, you shall never see it again. And there you shall be offered for sale to your enemies as male and female slaves, but no one will buy you." After the Romans conquered and destroyed Jerusalem, what few Jews survived, they took to Egypt and they sold them as slaves. So anyway, here's what Moses said was going to happen to the land. He says, the land is going to be cursed, okay? "The whole land is brimstone, salt and burning. It is not sown, nor does it bear, nor does any grass grow there. Like the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim, which the Lord overthrew in his anger and his wrath. All nations would say, why has the Lord done so to this land? What does the heat of this great anger mean? Then people would say, because they have forsaken the covenant of the Lord God and their fathers, which he made with them when he brought them out of the land of Egypt." Remember, this was the land of milk and honey. The spies described it as lush fields, growing tremendous crops and having tremendous flocks of livestock and herds and growing all the vegetables. By the way, in the valley of Jezreel, that just those few square miles there, it literally can supply Europe with all the fruits and vegetables that Europe needs. Just that one little area. Yes.
What was that part? What verse?
Oh,
was that you read?
in chapter 29, verse 23,
Oh, okay.
going all the way through, I'm going to go all the way through 28. Then the anger of the Lord was aroused against this land to bring on it every curse that is written in this book. In other words, the former part of Deuteronomy chapter 28. And the Lord uprooted them from their land in anger, in wrath, and in great indignation, and cast them into another land as it is to this day. But then, the same Moses who talked about the worldwide dispersion also said, but in the latter days, I'm going to bring you back into the land. And of course, this is why they had such those, they thought the Lord was coming back so quick, because for the first time in 2,000 years, Israel is coming back to the land. In other words, there is a nation of Israel. There was no nation of Israel for like 1,800 years. Didn't exist. But in May 18th, 1948, May 14th, 1948, the nation of Israel was reestablished in the land, but in unbelief, as it says in Ezekiel chapter 37. So anyway, Moses talks about that now. Chapter 30, verse 1. Now it shall come to pass, when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I have set before you, and you call them to mind among all nations, where the Lord your God drives you, and you return to the Lord your God and obey his voice according to all that I command you today, you and your children with all your heart and with all your soul, that the Lord your God will bring you back from captivity and have compassion on you and gather you again from all the nations where the Lord your God has scattered you. If any one of you are driven out to the farthest parts under heaven, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will bring you. Then the Lord your God will bring you to the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it. Now, Moses, remember before the people enter the land, now Moses is telling them what will happen, which will start to happen 3,500 years later. He's telling them, in other words, he's going to the very end of their history. But then he says, while they are in the land, now he talks about the new birth, the new covenant. Chapter 30, verse 6. And the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, that you may live. So in other words, he was promising them that they would not only go back into the land, but later on said God would circumcise their hearts. In other words, that's the new covenant that Jeremiah and Ezekiel talk about. So again, Ezekiel and Jeremiah, they're only expanding upon what Moses already talked about in the law, in the Torah. In Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 29, he talks about the coming tribulation period. I mean, now he's future to us. Evil will befall you in the latter days, because you will do evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger through the work of your hands. Okay, so he's telling them their future before they ever set foot in the land. He says before they step foot in the land, he says, because of disobedience and unbelief, you will get kicked out of the land 2 times. The second time you'll be scattered in all the nations of the world, but in the latter years, the latter days, I'm bringing you back. Even if you're in the farthest corners of the earth, nations, 12,000 miles away from Israel, I'll bring you back. In other words, and he talks about it's a occurring theme all the way through the books of the prophets. So Moses gives them a history lesson from the past, the present, and the future. And of course, the critics don't believe what's written about in the future, so they say the book's a phony. Most importantly, Moses tells Israel about the new covenant. Okay, and I already read that. So let's take a look at some theological themes. Deuteronomy speaks much about the attributes of God. By the way, I'm going to take one probably the very last session that we have, and I'm going to talk about the God, how God is described in the Pentateuch. We mostly talked about a people, a constitution, and a land, but the very last time we're here, we'll talk about how God reveals himself in the Pentateuch. So in Deuteronomy, God reveals that there is only one God. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 39, chapter 6, verse 4. There is only one God. Which, remember, Israel was surrounded by pagan nations who believed and worshipped many gods. Chapter 4, verse 39, and chapter 6, verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. All right, God reveals that he is a jealous God, chapter 4, verse 24. He is a faithful God, chapter 7, verse 9. He is a loving God, chapter 7, verse 13. God is merciful, chapter 4, verse 31. God calls himself Father. In other words, the fact that God is a Father is revealed in chapter 32, verse 6. He states that he is the God of gods and Lord of lords, and he is an impartial judge. In other words, he's a judge that doesn't take bribes. Chapter 10, verses 17 and 18.
10 what?
17. Chapter 10, verses 17 and 18. In Deuteronomy is introduced the fear of the Lord. He says that you may fear this glorious and awesome name, the Lord your God. Deuteronomy 28:58. And literally the Hebrew, Yahweh Elohika, the Lord your God, Yahweh Elohika. The Lord your God, by the way, in the book of Deuteronomy is repeated over 250 times. So it's a major theme. Okay. Actually, I think it's for the whole Pentateuch, but numerous times. Okay. The greatest commandment is first mentioned in Deuteronomy 6:5. If you quote the full instance of the greatest commandment, it's, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Remember, Jesus said that's the first and greatest commandment? That's in Deuteronomy. So this is quoted by Jesus in three of the Gospels. Matthew 22:37. Matthew 22:37. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. Matthew 12:30. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. That's how it says in Mark. In Luke, again, he stresses again, you shall love the Lord with all your heart, soul, and strength. Okay? And basically that one law, the greatest commandment, is kind of like an expansion of the first commandment in the 10 Commandments. The Shema was central and was a repeat of the first of the 10 Commandments. In other words, commandment number 1, you shall have no other gods before me. Or you shall have no other gods before me. Do you all know what I mean when I say the Shema? It's the Hebrew word for hear. It's not Shema. That's what a lot of people say. Do you know the Shema? No, it's Shema. It's and there's a half vowel. It's Shema, like Shema. Yeah.
Means to hear.
It means to hear. So, like, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. In other words, the Lord is one Jehovah. So, like in Hebrew, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. The Jewish people, they're going, Israelites, they would substitute Adonai for Yahweh because the name Yahweh or Yahweh or Jehovah was so sacred, they didn't dare pronounce it. So what they did was they substituted Adonai, which means sovereign or Lord or Master. But everybody knew that they meant Jehovah, so that way they wouldn't be taking his name in vain if they happen to say it lightheartedly or superficially and stuff. So, and of course we know, like, if the first greatest commandment is quoted in Deuteronomy, or recorded in Deuteronomy, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with our heart, soul, and strength. Okay, with all your strength. There is no mind there because there is no word for mind in Hebrew. When you see that word mind in the Old Testament, basically that's the translators putting something in there so that you understand it. With them, it was the heart. The heart is the thing that did the thinking. Okay. The second greatest commandment is, of course, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Remember when we talked about Leviticus, that's the most quoted verse out of the Old Testament. It's quoted over, 9 times? Something like that. So, in other words, in the law, in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, comes the first and greatest commandments. So in Jesus' temptations by the devil, Jesus quoted exclusively from Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 8:3 is quoted in Matthew 4:4 and Luke 4:4. Maybe just go ahead and find those passages for you. Deuteronomy 8:3. Okay, last part of the verse. That he might make you know that man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord. Okay, Jesus quoted that. Remember, Satan said, if you are the Son of God, turn these stones to bread. And then Jesus quoted this. And he quoted it in Matthew 4:4 and Luke 4:4. In Deuteronomy 6:16, he says, you shall not tempt the Lord your God as you tempted him in Massah. In other words, this part right here, you shall not tempt the Lord your God. That's quoted by Jesus in Matthew 4:7 and Luke 4:12. In other words, it's when Jesus was being tempted by the devil. And then in Luke 6:13, that's quoted in Matthew 4:10 and Luke 4:8. So Deuteronomy 6:13 states, you shall fear the Lord your God and serve him. That's what Jesus quotes there. So the command is given to fear the Lord your God. You shall fear the Lord your God. In other words, in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 20, and also in the 6:13, which I just read here, if I just read the whole thing, in 6:13, you shall fear the Lord your God and serve him, and shall take oaths in his name. So you shall fear the Lord your God. It's a command. And we just touched on it a little bit last week, what the fear of the Lord meant. So, as far as the New Testament's concerned, the book of Deuteronomy is quoted over 40 times. The book of Deuteronomy is only exceeded by Psalms and the book of Isaiah. And there are, of course, there are many more allusions to Deuteronomy in the New Testament. In other words, Deuteronomy is alluded to a substantial number of times, but is outright quoted 40 times. And I read off about 10 places in the New Testament where Deuteronomy is quoted. Some by Christ, and of course some by the apostles and stuff. So let's look at our conclusion to the introduction. Okay. Deuteronomy brings into focus all that had been revealed in Genesis to Numbers, as well as its implications for the people as they entered the land. In other words, basically Moses was doing with the people what I keep doing with you. I keep trying to summarize everything. So the first generations is poised on the east bank of the Jordan River, getting ready to enter the land. I mean, they're so excited they can see it. They're still getting manna and all that stuff, but they haven't crossed over the Jordan yet. And they are just chomping at the bit. They are ready to go. So Moses is now summarizing the past law that was given, and plus he gives their future history before they enter the land. And the people are just sitting there having to listen to that. I kind of think about it like how we're doing right now. I'm talking to you, and I know how important this is, but I know a lot of you are thinking about, man, I sure am hungry. I sure would like to have lunch right now. Moses is talking to the people about the law and what it meant to them and how important it's going to be, and they're all thinking, man, I would sure like to see what grapes taste like. Man, I wonder what, they're wondering about all these things. Man, I wish you would just stop talking so we can enter the land. I'm ready to go. That's what they're thinking while all of this is going on. Poor analogy, but it's pretty close, I guess. Pretty accurate. Oh, that's scary. Okay. God knew that the Israelites would not keep the Palestinian covenant, and so the new covenant is prophesied in chapter 30, verse 6. I mean, Moses is telling them, God tells Moses, they're not going to keep the law. I know that as soon as they enter, they'll see all those houses, all those fields, all that wealth, and they're going to forget who gave it to them. And then I'm going to have to judge them. They're going to follow other gods, and I'm going to have to judge them some more, and then I'm going to have to kick them out of the land, just like I'm kicking out the Canaanites right now. I mean, that's what God tells Moses later on. So then, of course, right towards the end, Deuteronomy records the death of Moses. Okay, now we're going to get somebody asked about Moses' condition when he died. Remember when Aaron died? Aaron's going along just fine, and then God just tells Moses, "Hey, tell Aaron it's time. Time for what? It's time to die. So go up on the mountain, and you're going to be gathered to your fathers. It's time to die." That's my paraphrase. Okay. So Deuteronomy records the death of Moses in chapter 32, verses 48 to 52. So that's the first place. And then, of course, God allows Moses to view the land of Canaan from the vantage point of Mount Nebo in Moab. So if you kind of think of this, God says, hey, climb the top of the hill. I'm going to let you look at the land. Well, but by the way, you're not coming down off that mountain alive. Okay.
Sorry, Moses.
Okay.
Did you tell him that he's going to die on that mountain?
Basically, yeah, it's time to die.
Okay.
He's going to tell Moses that.
Did he tell him?
Yeah, let's take a look at.
It's like, oh, by the way, he's not coming down.
And right before he dies, like passing out a death sentence, he reminds him why he's doing it. Remember the waters at the Meribah where you and Aaron, you struck the rock twice when I said speak to it? Remember I said you're going to die, not going to the land? Well, that time has come. The people are getting ready to go in the land, so you have to die.
Poor old Moses.
Yeah.
Wait, was he the last person to die?
He was the last person of the last generation to die. Yeah.
Except for Joshua and Caleb.
Huh?
Yeah.
Except for Joshua and Caleb.
Well, I mean, he was the last person of that generation to die who didn't get to enter the land. Let me qualify that. And you're right, Joshua and Caleb, they died after they were in the land. But remember, that's because they were faithful. Moses wasn't faithful, well, you know, in that one instance. Okay. In verse 48, chapter 32, then the Lord spoke to Moses that very same day, saying, go up this mountain of the Abiram, Mount Nebo, which is in the land of Moab, across from Jericho. View the land of Canaan. In other words, I'll give you a high vantage point so that you can look across the Jordan and look across the expanse of the land, which I gave to the children of Israel as a possession. And then he says, verse 50, and die on the mountain which you ascend, and be gathered to your people, just as Aaron your brother died on Mount Hor, and was gathered to his people, because you trespassed against me among the children of Israel at the waters of Meribah, Kadesh, and the wilderness of Zin, because you did not allow me in the midst of the children of Israel. In other words, you profaned my name when you struck the rock twice.
He's really sticking it to him.
What's that?
He's really sticking it to him.
Well, he told him back then, says, you're not going to make it. You're going to die. First your brother, well, first Miriam. Actually, Miriam was dead before that. She was dead before the waters of Meribah. And then Aaron and Moses, they both, in cahoots together, they both are the same, and they strike the rock. And God graciously lets the water come out, fills a whole reservoir full of water, and then secretly tells Moses and Aaron, psst, go over here. That's right, you, Moses, Aaron, I got a word for you. He took them to the woodshed. Okay. Yeah. Says, I'm not going to punish you right now, but you're going to die before you enter the land.
But a huge one. I'm sorry. Moses did get to see the promised land later on, though, when he came to visit Jesus.
Yeah, but that's after his death.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He's counting.
Yeah, I'm going to mention a few other things. I got to get to the part where the question is being asked. I only got like 15 minutes left. Oh, we'll finish before that. So Aaron died on Mount Hor in Numbers 20:28. God reminds me of that in in Deuteronomy 32:50. Miriam died in the wilderness of Zin in Numbers 20, verse 1. By the way, because God told them at the beginning of their wilderness journey, when they sin at the waters of Meribah, they know that they don't have long to live because the 40 years is almost up. So they know that, can you imagine the feeling in your heart where you know what's coming, the 40 years is almost up, but you know that you're not crossing the river, you're going to die. And so, but it's still a surprise where God just says, everything's going along great, Aaron's doing his job, and it's like, oh, let bygones be bygones and all that stuff. And then God says, oh, by the way, Aaron, time to die. By the way, Moses, go up on the mountain, look at the land, really salivate over the beauty of it and all that stuff, but you're not coming off that mountain alive. That's basically what God told him. So before Moses died, God reminded Moses of he and Aaron's sin at the waters of Meribah, Kadesh, and the wilderness of Zin. Joshua records now, because remember, after Moses was dead, obviously he's not doing any more writing, right? Does that make sense? Because he's dead. So Joshua records, so Moses, the servant of Jehovah, died there in the land of Moab. He buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows his grave to this day. Deuteronomy 34, verses 5 through 7. Yeah.
Where in the Bible does it talk about Michael fighting?
I will get to that. That's the next thing I'm going to talk about. I am being second guessed. Okay. But good. Okay. It's a good question. Okay. No, actually, no. It's Jude verse 9. It's Jude 9. Okay. So perhaps Jehovah delegated Moses' burial to Michael the archangel as recorded in Jude 9. It says the Lord buried him, but perhaps Michael was like burying him, or at least Michael was there when that is happening. If Jehovah buried him personally, that's one thing, and you could probably read it that way, but in Jude 9 it's going to talk about Michael being there at the burial and disputing over the body of Moses. It says, quote, "Yet Michael the archangel, in contending with the devil, when he disputed about the body of Moses." In other words, there's a dispute over the body of Moses after Moses is dead. Okay. So Michael is the one disputing with Satan. He said, "The Lord rebuke you." And so can you imagine if Jehovah buried Moses, in other words, Jehovah the Son, Jesus, if he's burying him, Michael the archangel is right there also, and Satan is arguing with Michael, and if Jehovah's doing the shoveling and all that stuff, okay, just picture it that way. Michael just looks to Jehovah and says, "The Lord rebuke you, I'm not." But of course, remember, if somebody with the strength and power of Michael was fearful to rebuke Satan, I mean, what should that say about us? We're never told to rebuke Satan. We're told to resist him. Never are we told to rebuke him. We are told to resist him. It says that 3 times in the New Testament.
Wait, he looked to Jehovah and said...
I'm just saying, if Jehovah was doing the burying, if he was actually burying the body, I would maintain that Michael the archangel was God's representative and was burying Moses so that no human being would know where he was buried. But Satan wanted the body probably to use it for idolatry and stuff like that. Because remember, if hundreds of years later, if they're worshiping the brass snake on the pole that Hezekiah finally destroyed, called Nehushtan, that's what they called it, what would they do with the body of Moses? And if you don't think that people would worship Moses, look at the Catholic Church and look at the relics, the body parts of saints that are worshipped to this day.
Coming
Yeah.
out of Egypt, wouldn't they know how to mummify the body too?
Yeah,
Yeah, so they could.
but they wouldn't have the materials to do it. And God never said to do that. God said, get them in the ground. God just said, bury them. Okay. So anyway, Michael buried Moses to prevent Satan from using Moses' body for some diabolical purpose and not stated. I'm pulling this out of my MacArthur Study Bible. It's one of John MacArthur's notes. So God sent Michael to be certain it was that the body was buried. Jude quoted a pseudepigraphal source called the Assumption of Moses. In other words, it was a book of the Apocrypha, and God, what was quoted by Jude happens to be accurate because it's in the Bible. In other words, it talks about, this document talks about Michael the archangel having a dispute with Satan over the body of Moses. So anyway, to finish up, Moses was, go ahead and turn to 34 verse 7. Let's read what it says here. 34 verse 7. By the way, we're just finishing up the introduction, then we'll talk about what's in the book of Deuteronomy, and then the last week, of course, we'll talk about God. Okay, it says, Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were not dim, nor his natural vigor diminished. Okay. What's that? Okay. It's, I'm going to define what it means. I was thinking about whether I should do that or not, but I've been defining most everything else. He was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were not dim, nor his natural vigor diminished. New King James. So in other words, if you read the regular commentaries that talk about it, he was physically healthy in every way. The energy or spark or drive of his natural life was still there. But when it talks about his vigor, his natural, the King James says his natural forces were not abated. Okay, what it means is that his eyesight was still 20/20. His vision was not dimmed. And basically, he was still capable of having sexual relations to the day he died. That's literally what it means. In other words, when you get to be like a really old man, probably way beyond me, I hope, you can still maintain relations with your wife. It's basically saying when Moses was 120, he was still able. That's what, when it talks about his natural forces not being abated, in other words, he was physically capable in every way, even at 120, even at 120 years of age. So quite literally, when God says it's time to die, he just died.
Didn't his wife die? No, that was his
What's that?
His wife did she die?
Well, it doesn't talk about his wife. It would be his second wife. Remember, he married a black woman the second time. Remember, that's what Miriam and Aaron were upset about, that he married somebody outside who wasn't Jewish.
She was black.
I believe so, yeah. And so they disputed, and they said, hey, you know, the Lord talks to us. Remember, that's where the Lord appears and God judges. When Miriam and Aaron rebel against Moses, God judged Miriam for starting it and gave her leprosy. Yeah.
I thought his first wife was black. And he just
She was a Midianite woman. Her name was Zipporah. Little bird.
Little bit.
Little bird. Yeah, her name means little bird.
Better than Big Bird.
Yeah. Yeah, we're all familiar with Big Bird. But he married Zipporah, little bird. Okay. By the way, remember Balak, the king of Beor? Balak, the king of Beor, but I'm sorry, king of Zippor. Okay. What am I saying? Zippor. Zippor means little bird, but it's a boy little bird. It's a male little bird. When I put the AH on it, Zipporah, it makes it feminine, so it's a female little bird. By the way, Torah is the law. It's a feminine word. Torah, yeah. Okay. Any questions? Up to date. Any questions? Laura? Okay. Okay. I guess if there are no questions, I have no choice but to terminate the class.
Terminate.